Good evening, everyone. My name is Denise Lucy. I am Director of the Institute for Leadership Studies and Professor of Business and Organizational Studies at Dominican University of California here in Marin County. And for many years, Book Passage, the San Francisco Bay Area's prized independent bookstore, has partnered with Dominican. And together we've welcomed 135 world-class change-leading authors to our campus and to our community. Our spring leadership lecture series sponsor is Bank of Marin. For 30 years, Bank of Marin has been a leading business and community bank in the San Francisco Bay Area. Thank you so much, Bank of Marin, for supporting our long-lasting and valuable community program. Elaine Petrocelli is president and founder of Book Passage, and she will tell you more about the upcoming lectures after tonight's presentation. Our distinguished speaker, Robert Reich, is the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Reich has served the administrations of 3 United States presidents. His 18 books, numerous articles and columns, and his blog are especially crucial at this time. Tonight, Professor Reich will be discussing his book, The System, Who Rigged It and How We Fix It. He will be in conversation with Bill Petrocelli. Bill is vice president of Book Passage, and he is also an author of 5 books. Bill's latest book is Electoral Bait and Switch: How the Electoral College Hurts American Voters and What Can Be Done About It. Please join me in welcoming our honored guest, Robert Reich, in conversation with Bill Petrocelli. Welcome.
Thanks, Denise. I'm Bill Petrocelli, and it's my honor tonight to be in conversation with Robert Reich. This is really an exciting thing for me because this is a wonderful book. And it's a book, you know, I'm sure people say this all the time, but if you're only going to read one book this year about economics, this is the book you should read. It's an amazing story. It's written with the way that Professor Reich always writes, it's well written, it's jargon free, it's remarkable in many ways. He writes with a nice subdued wit, and you don't often see that in books about economics. It's full of facts, but the kind of facts that invite themselves into your head. I think if there's one word that describes what he's trying to do in this book, is to look at our current economic problems in a systematic way, to link together all of the problems we have in the economy. And there are many, and he outlines them in the book, and he has some ideas of how to cure them. It's an urgent book. The problems aren't going to go away soon unless we do something about them. And they're the kind of problems that are directly connected with the kind of rioting we saw on January 6th, the kind of disaffection of many people in our society because of the way that they've been excluded from the economy. So I don't want to talk anymore. I want to ask Bob Reich to step in here and tell me a little bit about his book. I guess my first question would be, in the book, he talks about a massive transfer of wealth and political power that started to occur about 40 years ago in this country. And you lay out the reasons why that occurred and what it means for us. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Well, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Bill. And Elaine, thank you very much. Book Passage, extended session. I want to thank all of the people who made this evening possible, and thank all of you who have tuned in. Bill, in terms of what has happened, the major thrust and theme of the book is that we have seen over the past 40 years an extraordinary shift in not only wealth, but also political power in the United States especially, although we see similar shifts going on in other advanced, rich nations. And what that means is that in many respects, the biggest division politically is not so much between the right and the left, although that's still obviously important, but the biggest division is between democracy and what might be called oligarchy or a plutocracy. That is a good old Greek word, oligarchy, meaning essentially a government and a system and an economic system that is run by a fairly small number of people. And what we see politically in the United States over the past 40 years is that even though the economy has grown dramatically, the wages of most people have not grown. In fact, two-thirds of the workforce in the United States have seen stagnant or declining wages. And that's particularly true during the pandemic. The pandemic has accentuated and aggravated a lot of the trends that were there before. But we are seeing right now a kind of what's called a K-shaped uh, rep- uh, I was going to say recovery. It's not quite a recovery yet, but a K-shaped depression, recession, in which you have basically managerial, professional, and technical workers who are doing reasonably well. They are still collecting paychecks. They are still working remotely, most of them. Their savings are in the stock market. The stock market is doing wonderfully well. And then you have a majority, two-thirds of the workforce, doing very, very poorly. They are either out of work or they are simply out of the workforce altogether. A lot of women have left the workforce, and you have many people who are earning very, very little. Working in part-time jobs who'd rather work in full-time jobs. Again, this was the pattern and increasing the pattern before the pandemic. And the pandemic has made all of this worse, but it has also revealed, I think, and here's the good news, it's revealed uh, how important it is for the country to do something about this. And I'm relatively encouraged that the Biden administration and at least the Democrats in Congress and maybe a few Republicans are willing to make some quite significant structural changes.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I noticed from reading the book is the way in which you've sometimes the thing we think are causes are effects, and sometimes the things we think are effects are causes. But what the book points out is that all of these things are interrelated. That unless you have a systematic change, a comprehensive change in the economy, we're never going to get anywhere. And it's rare, I think, that you see a book like this that can look at the entire economy as one entity and not break it down into just looking at individual things we might want to change.
Well, this is why, really, Bill, I called it the system.
Yeah,
You can't separate economics from politics or from history or sociology or even from ethics. As I point out in the book, in the 19th century, through most of the 19th century, there wasn't even a, a field called economics until 1890, at which point the great Alfred Marshall wrote his Principles of Economics. But through most of the 19th century, it was all called political economy. It was all about the system. And in the 18th century, it wasn't even called political economy. The study of the system or the study of society was called moral philosophy because it was about what is a good society? How do you understand the nature of a good society? Adam Smith did not call himself an economist or even a political economist. He called himself a moral philosopher. And so in the book, I try to ask underlying much of what is a systemic change over the last 40 years. What do we want? What's the ethical norm? What's the center of where we ought to be as a society? And that's, again, a question that I think needs to be asked more and more, particularly after the Trump administration and what we've all gone through.
right. You mentioned, I think you characterized the changes we've gone through, the changes that resulted in these problems. You have three different terminology you've used for them. Maybe you could explain them a little bit. One is the idea of a stakeholder corporation versus a stockholder corporation. The idea that corporations have changed the nature of the economy over particularly the last 40 years. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, up until the late 1970s, we had a form of capitalism that might be called stakeholder capitalism. Most big companies remained in the cities or the regions where they were founded. Most CEOs came up through the ranks of the companies and indeed were born in those same towns, those same cities. Uh, and therefore, and you also had very strong unions. The net result of all of that was that companies did not only function for the purpose of maximizing shareholder returns, they also functioned for the purpose of improving the well-being of their workers and also their communities. This all changed dramatically in the late 70s and 1980s with the advent of unfriendly, hostile takeovers, which shook up management in the 1980s, forced a lot of managers to do something that managers initially didn't want to do, and that was to fire a lot of workers, to leave their communities, abandon many of those communities. GE abandoned Schenectady. You had all across America, I use GE as an example, but all across America, you had companies leaving the places that they were founded and leaving their workers in the lurch, and instead, basically maximizing the well-being of only one of those stakeholders, and that was shareholders. Today, we still have uh, shareholder capitalism as opposed to stakeholder capitalism. Rather than unfriendly takeovers, however, we now have a stock market and a financial sector and people who and financial experts who uh, are looking at companies as potential objects of takeovers, potentially not necessarily unfriendly takeovers, but they could be friendly takeovers. But private equity, and I don't want to condemn anybody here, but private equity is a good example of a part of the financial industry that is advancing shareholder capitalism by disciplining, and I use that term advisedly, disciplining managers to perform for shareholders rather than for any other stakeholder. Now, in the 1980s, this was all justified as being in the interest of the economy, making America more efficient. We had managers who used the butcher metaphors of modern management, cutting to the bone and getting out the fat. And there was something to that. I don't want to suggest that the entire movement was wrong, but the net result was huge social costs in terms of abandoning large segments of America. Where is it right now? You've got the heartland of angry, disaffected, frustrated people who have not had a raise in years, who don't have jobs even before the pandemic, who have turned or did turn to a demagogue because of their anger and their frustration, who took advantage of that anger and frustration. Well, a lot of it started in the late 70s, early 1980s, with this notion of shareholder as opposed to stakeholder capitalism.
It's interesting. You pointed to these corporate raiders. I remember when I first heard about Carl Icahn and others, it was sort of a quixotic thing. It never occurred to me that what was going on there was something that would affect the fundamentals of the economy, because it just looked like it was all way off on the fringes. But you point out in the book quite clearly that this was the first step leading to a lot of just what you described there, a lot of tightening of a corporation, a lot of leaving out of some of the stakeholders and making them sort of distant, maybe sometimes international institutions that have nothing to do with the community in which they operate. The other factor you mentioned and I'm interested that you link them together in your description. One is unionized labor and corporate monopoly, the change from one to the other. I always think of labor issues as being an important issue. And certainly as a owner of a small business, I think of monopoly issues as being a small issue, but I've never quite linked them together the way you have in the book. Could you describe your thinking about that?
Well, again, we're looking at structural change in the economy as a system. And one of the biggest structural changes, in addition to moving from stakeholder to shareholder capitalism, is moving from organized labor. That is a time when workers joined together in the 1950s, 1960s. About 35% of the entire private sector workforce was organized in labor unions. That gave them a big voice. That gave them the opportunity to negotiate and get higher wages, better working conditions. Uh, and what we have seen at that time is that you didn't have much of a monopoly problem in America in the private sector. Now you have the tables completely reversed. Right now, instead of 35% of private sector workers unionized, the percentage in the economy, the percentage of private sector workers who are unionized is down to 6.2%, which is basically no bargaining power at all. And meanwhile, in terms of monopolization, you have big companies that are taking more and more of the American economy and gaining, because of that, greater and greater strength in terms of bargaining and negotiation. As a bookstore, you know about Amazon, for example.
Oh yeah.
Well, Amazon is an example of
It's true.
huge bargaining power, not just with consumers, but really with uh, those who are selling books or anything else, because it's the contractors, it's the sellers to Amazon. You've got to sell through Amazon. Many people do, and that gives Amazon extraordinary bargaining power. Even before the pandemic. Another example of how the pandemic has accentuated and sped up everything that was occurring before the pandemic. Amazon is now is now much larger than it was, but it's obviously not just Amazon. It is big tech. It is big banks. The five biggest banks before the financial crisis of 2008, the five biggest banks had about 20% of all the financial assets in the United States. Today, they have about 44% of all the financial assets in the United States. They really are too big to fail.
Right.
And we could go around the economy, but the net result of this shift in bargaining power from workers through unions to big monopolies is that you have more and more profits going to big companies. And you see that in the stock market. I mean, the stock market is, again, a manifestation of what is happening in the rest of the economy. But the stock market, most importantly, is not the economy. It's a manifestation. Corporate earnings are very high because you have all of this bargaining power in big corporations listed on the stock market. Yet at the same time, the economy in terms of the Main Street economy is not nearly as strong as it used to be.
Well, it's interesting you say that because these are two issues that I find very important. Two issues I hadn't thought about as being linked, but the effort now, and I think the Justice Department and other government institutions are starting to take a little harder look at monopolization and maybe getting ready to turn the tide to enforce the anti-monopoly laws. But what you're suggesting here is that that's also in the workers' interest, that strong antitrust protection of small businesses ultimately will benefit workers. And I think the reverse is true. And I think it's a perfect example of how the whole system is linked together, and we need to figure out a way to improve upon it. And I think you're right that the new administration seems to be moving in the right direction, and I have the same hopes you do. Let me just, before we talk about some of the solutions, there was one other thing you mentioned, which I hadn't really understood the complete significance of, and that is the way in which the stock market and corporate trading has been released from any kinds of restrictions. You talk about the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which was something I heard about when it happened, had never heard of the last Glass-Steagall Act until it was repealed. And now I realize after reading your description of it, that how important that was to maintaining the economy that we had.
These three macro trends that we've been talking about, that is the movement from stakeholder to shareholder capitalism, the movement from labor unions having bargaining power to big monopolies in the private sector having monopoly power.
Right.
And then thirdly, the financialization of the economy are all intimately related. They all happened at the same time. Each one of them fed the other and enhanced and enabled the other. Each one left out huge numbers of Americans and fed ultimately widening inequality of income and wealth, and also build political power. Because the net result of these three interlocking movements has been to give the, again, I'm going to use that term, oligarchy, a fairly small number of people in America, huge power over our democracy. And as was said by Justice Louis Brandeis at the end of the first Gilded Age, if you assume that we're in the second Gilded Age now, which I do, he said, we have a choice in America. We can either have great wealth in the hands of a few, or we can have a democracy, but we can't have both. And I think that that is the bottom line here, because if we lose our democracy, and we are dangerously close to losing it, and we came, as we all know, very close over the past 4 years. If we lose that democracy, then what do we have left? Then we can't do much as a society, and we have no legacy to give to our children.
Well, you're absolutely right. I agree with it. You point out three different ways in which an oligarchy, and I think the term probably applies here, can kind of perpetuate itself. I think one is through a belief system it establishes. Well, let's talk about that first. You talk about market fundamentalism as being the belief that the oligarchy tries to put out, which is basically, if you're not doing well, if the market has told you you're not worth very much, and get over it. And if somebody else is doing a little bit better, well, it's because the market never lies, and that's the result of that. But you poke a hole in that and kind of knock it completely out of the park.
I think it's important for people to understand that the market is not a creature of nature. It's not out there separate from a society. I mean, the market is created by people. It's created by legislators who decide, basically what's going to be property and what are the limits of property and what's going to be tradable and what's not tradable, and how bankruptcy is going to work, and what's going to be where liability is going to be located. These are legislative decisions. Administrators in administrative agencies also make these kinds of decisions, as do executives and governors and also presidents. And so you've got people who are making the market and changing the market rules continuously in small ways, in really hundreds of thousands of ways that we don't necessarily see because we don't see the totality of the system. But over the past 40 years, as wealth and power have moved to the top, the entire system of laws and rules has shifted in the direction of maximizing basically the wealth and power of those at the top. I'll give you a good example. Bankruptcy law used to allow people who could not pay their mortgage to basically reorganize their debt so that they could stay in their homes. Bankruptcy law also used to allow people who could not pay off their student loans or got behind in paying their student loans to reorganize student loans so that they could basically maintain themselves. But both of those features of bankruptcy were changed in the early 2000s by the financial industry's power over Washington in changing and altering and amending bankruptcy laws. So that if you're now a homeowner and you can't afford to pay your mortgage, well, you're out of luck. Basically, you might be on the street, literally. The same thing with student debt. And we could go on. I could give you example after example after example. And they each one of them seems small taken by itself. But if you look at it systemically, what it means is that the market itself has shifted ground. No longer is it something that is relatively neutral. It is now, to a much larger extent than we've seen it any time over the last really 80 years, because in the Gilded Age, we had a similar phenomenon. but we hadn't seen it, really anything like that until the last 20 or 30 years, where the market starts to change in a kind of vicious cycle in which those forces that have the most wealth and the power change it to give them more and more wealth and power. Let me say one more thing about this bill, because it's a very important ingredient. This is not a conspiracy. It's not as if they're bad people. The reason the book is called The System, and the reason that I try to get into these details and explain them and show the relationship between all of these pieces of the puzzle, is that there's no evil intent. You can't just, and it would be wrong to blame a financier or a particular person who's the head of a CEO of a company or anybody else. All of them are part of a system, and the system itself has its own logic and its own direction and its own incentives. Uh, we have to make changes, and those changes are possible, but they're possible only if we all understand the system as a system.
Well, and one of the things that the system has is political power, and as you point out in the book, that has changed enormously over the years. So the influence of corporate money in politics is, in some cases, dominant. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, but that's an important feature of it: the campaign money and other. I wouldn't call it bribery, but it's certainly money that goes into the system.
It's campaign money, lobbying money. It's not just political action committees. It's also a lot of corporate money that finds its way through so-called independent expenditures. Through it's dark money. In fact, it's very hard to trace where all this money shows up. But it's also corporate issues campaigns. So, for example, Uber and Lyft put on the California ballot Proposition 22 last November that enabled them and other similarly situated companies to easily, far more easily than they could before, classify their workers as independent contractors. Now, that was the work of Lyft and Uber. They spent about $200 million on that campaign, and they got what they wanted. There is now a California law that makes it very easy for Uber and Lyft to classify its workers as independent contractors and not pay them a minimum wage and not pay them any kind of social security or workers' compensation or unemployment insurance or anything else that most other workers in our society are entitled to. But I use that just as an example of how political power and money are changing the rules of the game. And that changing of the rules of the game in many ways is hurting a lot of people. And those people who feel that they are not represented, that they have no voice, that the game is rigged against them, they don't just do nothing. They are sitting ducks for demagogues who prey upon them and take their rage and their anger and channel it in a variety of ways. And again, we are sitting through right now a trial, an impeachment trial, and I don't know how many of you and Bill, I don't know if you actually saw that very, very upsetting and heart-wrenching video, that 13-minute video of actually the storming.
No, I saw it. No, it was something. It was something awful.
That is not completely divorced from what we're talking about right now.
No, and that's one of the things you point out is the other way that the system kind of maintains control is, I think, what you call is diversions and scapegoats of kind of maybe not intentionally or maybe intentionally convincing people that have been hurt by the economy that it's somebody else's fault. It's the fault of immigrants, or it's the fault of offshore companies. It's the fault of minorities or something. Anybody other than the people who may have been the ones causing the problem.
It's a
very serious problem.
Well, it's a kind of divide and conquer strategy. That is, instead of running the risk that Black people and Latinos and poor people and working class people and working class whites and lower middle class and middle class people will come together and assert their power politically, the divide and conquer strategy keeps them apart and angry at each other. Again, it's easy to assume that this is a conspiracy. It's not. This is just something that's been going on for a very long time, and it works. And because it works, it is part of the system, but it's a very diabolical part of the system.
Yeah. Um, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. I'm sure the answer is going to be you have to do all these things at one time in order to make any kind of change. But I think it might be useful to pick out a couple of issues and talk about them and to see how important you think that a change on this one issue might be as a wedge to open up change in the entire system. And let's start with something you're very familiar with as a former Secretary of Labor. What changes do you think we should make right now, be pushing right now for working people to get them in a better position and use improvement in labor issues as a way of helping change the overall economy? What would be your first steps?
Well, the logical thrust of what we've talked about so far is to try to, number one, get big money out of politics, um, and
Right.
so that our democracy can function once again in the interests of everybody rather than the oligarchy. The good news is that there is some movement. The first bill introduced in the House of Representatives in this session of Congress is the same as the first bill introduced in the Senate in this session of Congress. And both of those bills are designed to provide public financing of elections. That is, provide public matching money to small donors. And that's a way of getting around Citizens United and some of the Supreme Court decisions that say money is speech and corporations have First Amendment speech rights. It's a very important step. It also reduces the revolving door between business and government. It also makes it harder for companies to use the dodge of dark money groups and so-called social welfare organizations to avoid accountability and avoid transparency. So people are on this. The good news, Bill, is that these issues are being addressed. I think another important step has to do with dealing with the costs that we've already mentioned. Antitrust enforcement is important for average people. It means not only lower prices. I mean, why are we in this country paying the highest pharmaceutical prices of anybody in the entire of all rich nations? Well, it's partly because of the stranglehold that the pharmaceutical companies have on our government and the fact that big pharmaceutical companies are essentially monopolies. Why is it that we are paying more for internet service than almost any other inhabitant of a rich nation? Well, again, because there are very few internet service providers, and those that are out there have a great deal of political power and monopoly power. And I could go on and on. So antitrust is important. Incidentally, a few new studies show the degree to which workers, and I'm talking about hourly workers in the heartland, people who don't have much choice of job, how monopolization hurts them because to a greater and greater extent, they are facing a job market of only one or two or possibly three employers. And those employers are so large that they can essentially repress and suppress wages.
That's a fascinating study. I mean, who is it? Who commissioned that, and where can I find it?
Well,
As somebody who's very interested in antitrust law. I,
Yeah.
I want to
Well,
chase that one down.
I will make a point of sending it to you. Jason Furman, who was in the Obama administration Council of Economic Advisors, was the lead author on one of those studies.
That's great.
And it's really interesting.
Well,
And
it's something, you know, that I always knew kind of instinctually, but it's nice to see somebody's put a study and some data behind it, because it's when you look at antitrust law as a form of, I've immediately looked at it as, first time I looked at it as a form of political power rather than economic power. And there was some analogy you used, I think it was a quote from Warren Buffett: the only wants to invest in companies that have a moat around them. Doesn't want companies that have any competition. And the minute you do that, you put a stranglehold on your economy. So this is very, very important.
exactly.
I'm glad to see that's on your list of things that need to be done. How about free education and student debt? How important is that in turning the economy around?
Well, it's terribly important in terms of helping the middle class and the working class and
Okay.
poor people, because we've got to the point in this country, and I think it's a sad point, where the only way of ascending into the middle class is with a four-year college degree. I think that should not be the case. Other countries, rich countries, have far better developed systems of vocational and technical education than we have, leading to good jobs. But in the United States, you've got to have a four-year college degree. The big difference between the people who are doing well in the economy and the people who are falling off the economy is that question of who has the college degree. You look at Republican voters in the heartland, they are mostly people without college degrees. People who voted for Trump, mostly without college degrees. Look at Democratic voters, increasingly are people with college degrees, and they are, again, they are on the coasts, and they're in Chicago, and they are doing reasonably well. So we've got to make education, and I think public education especially, free. In the 1960s, we were almost there. I mean, I remember, at Berkeley, the tuition and fees were down to almost zero.
Right.
Everybody assumed that
I was a student then, and I can tell you the fee for about a year of education was about $100.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize how lucky I was until many years later, when I now look at what college tuition is and think, oh my God, I don't think my parents could afford to send me there.
No, and University of California tuition is now, or fees are now more than $15,000 a year. Not even adjusted for inflation, $100 when you were going
Right.
is not 15,000.
That was a long time ago.
Now. But this is again is an example of a systemic change that happened without a huge amount of fanfare. We didn't see it coming. State legislatures just basically started to withdraw funding for higher education, not only in California, but all around the country. They had other priorities. It was understandable. Those other priorities, though, meant that education, higher education, increasingly was regarded as a private investment rather than a public good. And higher education really is a public good. We all benefit from people who are well educated and people who have an option to get good jobs. It's not a zero-sum game in which there are only a set number of good jobs. And again, it's interesting that the great shift, the U-turn, occurred there in the late 70s, just like the U-turn of a lot of the systemic changes that I've been talking about with you occurred about that time.
Yeah. Healthcare is a big issue. It's certainly an issue for people on a personal level, but how important is universal healthcare or something like that in terms of change in the overall economy?
It's critically important because we are spending as a nation almost 20%, almost a fifth of our entire economy, our entire gross domestic product
Mhm.
on health. And we are getting among the worst results of any rich country. We're spending the most per capita, per person of any rich country on healthcare and getting the worst results. And that is a sign that we've got to rethink it much more profoundly than merely the Affordable Care Act, which I think is a huge and important advance. But we've got to move to what is called a single payer system, because a single payer system gets rid of a lot of the overhead, the advertising, the marketing, the administrative costs. A lot of nurses today, Bill, are spending a third of their time simply taking note of what they're doing so that they can bill it properly to the relevant insurer, whose paperwork also is going up. This is ridiculous. We also have more monopoly problems seeping into this system, the healthcare system. Uh, every year that goes by, we've got larger and larger economic concentrations in hospitals and in various pharmaceuticals, as I mentioned before, and other practices. It 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 it's taking money out of the pockets of average working people, and it is putting them into the pockets of shareholders. In the 1950s, 1960s, early 1970s, Blue Cross and Blue Shield were not for profit. They actually were fairly efficient insurers. They got and were forced into becoming profit-making entities because of other uh, big insurers that were raking off essentially the most healthy and youngest people. The whole system was designed and became designed by the 1970s, 80s, 90s. Uh, it became irrationally designed. It became designed for basically to avoid sick people. Can you imagine a healthcare really? Can you imagine a healthcare system built designed to avoid sick people? And that's what we have.
Right.
That's what we've inherited. That's why the feature of the Affordable Care Act that protects people with pre-existing conditions is so important. But
Right.
that's the beginning. Uh, Again, I want to go back to the notion this is a systemic problem. You can't deal with one piece of it without understanding how it got there. What's the history of it, and how does it relate to every other problem?
Well, if one thing comes across in your book, it's that these things are all related. One issue that's dear to me, and I hope that everybody from President Biden on down says that uh, doing something to protect the environment, to protect against global warming, will be a boon for the economy and a great job creating idea and help everybody out economically. I hope they're right. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think they are right. I mean, all of the studies I've seen strongly suggest that investments, public and private investments in wind and solar and non-fossil based fuels, not only pay for themselves, but also improve living standards overall. One of the biggest and not fully adequately explored aspects of the environmental deterioration that we all experience, and the wildfires in California, the flooding on the Gulf Coast, the hurricanes, the all of the ways in which our country is affected, and we are paying huge costs for the destruction of the environment. One of the aspects of it that's not adequately faced is the fact that poor people are much more vulnerable to environmental hazards than are rich people. I mean, poor people live in the most fragile housing. They live in floodplains. They are the ones who are most directly affected by all of the environmental disasters. So the problem of the environment is not just an economic cost. It's not just a social cost. It's also a cost that erodes the foundations of our society and aggravates inequality.
Yeah. The one of the themes that the Biden administration is pushing right now, and I'm not totally sure I understand all the aspects of it, is that they need to spend a certain amount of money in order to stimulate the economy right now. And it doesn't seem like it's which one of the many programs built into their bill needs to be emphasized. It's just that the total amount has to reach, I think it's close to what, $2 trillion or something like that. Not sure I understand completely the logic of it, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I think I do. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there are two separate issues that are combined in that $1.9 trillion bill. One is the very critical issue of getting money to people who desperately need it, who have lost their jobs, who have problems with, again, health insurance, who can't take sick leave, who are subjected to this terrible pandemic. A lot of the benefits and public assistance that they relied on run out in about 4 weeks from now. So they have got to have some more assistance. State and local governments are also in terrible shape. California and many other states, and that shows up in everybody from teachers through firefighters, through social workers, everybody who is either losing their jobs because the state and local governments don't have enough, or people who are first responders in this pandemic who are desperately important, but they are, again, the states and locales don't have enough to pay them. That's also in the $1.9 trillion bill. There are additional things in that bill, like a child care and provisions for children. I don't know how much you've been following this bill, but we have now record numbers of children in California and around the United States who are in poverty and who are hungry at this very moment, who don't have adequate shelter at this very moment. The pandemic is part of the problem. Part of the problem is the deep recession that accompanies the pandemic. But the issue of child poverty has been worsening for years. And in that $1.9 trillion is a very important provision for children. Now, I said that there were really two big issues. One is what you need to do for a lot of people right now who are in trouble, including kids. The other that you raised is, well, why is it important to spend so much? That has to do with making sure that as the economy comes out of the pandemic, there is enough demand for goods and services so that people can get jobs. You can't rely merely on consumers or on businesses or on exports to provide that kind of demand. Government has to be the purchaser of last resort. The big mistake that the Obama administration made in 2009, when the economy was in trouble, when we had a great recession, when we had that financial crisis, was it didn't have a stimulus plan that was nearly large enough. Uh, and I think the Biden administration and Joe Biden himself learned a very important lesson. It is very important to be big and bold enough if you're going to have a recovery that really does work and gets a lot of people back to work.
Well, that's the way it's been described, but never quite as clearly as you did right there. I think you're right. Both of these, the individual programs they all sound important, but your description of the fact that you need that much money to increase demand and get the economy working makes perfect sense. Do you think that we can get out of this economic dilemma that we're in without some restrictions on the way that the for want of a better term, the oligarchs run things? For example, do we need restrictions on corporate compensation? Do we need restrictions on offshoring of corporate profits? Do we need the kind of regulation of corporate excess to bring things under control, or is that likely to take care of itself once the rest of the economy starts lifting up?
Well, it's not going to take care of itself. It depends on what kind of regulations you're talking about. I think that in terms of the ability of corporations, big corporations we're talking about, and very wealthy people to shelter their income and not pay taxes, that's a big deal. And we do have to crack down on that. What we know is that for every dollar invested in the IRS, something people don't, maybe you don't want to hear, but for every dollar invested in IRS enforcement, the United States gets $3 back in terms of taxes that should have been paid. And that means that for most of us taxpayers, that's good news because we are not tax cheats. It's because of some big tax cheats that we have to pay as much in taxes as we do. Uh, I do think that that needs tightening up. We talked about antitrust a moment ago. I think that's important. In terms of CEO pay, I don't think we should pick on CEOs, but I think that a wealth tax at a time in the nation's history when we have never seen, apart from the 1880s and 1890s, as much of the nation's income going to as small a sliver of people, a wealth tax makes a lot of sense. Since the start of the pandemic, America's 660 billionaires have increased their wealth by $1.1 trillion, which means if you do the math, that they could effectively, they're not going to do it, but they could effectively afford to pay every single American $3,800 in terms of a COVID survival check.
Right.
And
They can almost pay for the whole stimulus.
they could pay for the whole stimulus, and they could still come out as well as they were before the pandemic.
Right.
They would just go back to being multi-billionaires instead of multi-billionaires.
Well, the other thing you point out is the cutting of estate taxes in recent years has has increased the problem because the next generation will be wealthier and even less likely to pay taxes on that.
Yeah. Well, I here again, taking a systems approach, we see that if you look at wealth in America right now today, 60% of all wealth is inherited. Now, in other words, wealth is not a matter of being rewarded for being an entrepreneur or being somebody who invested wisely and carefully and built businesses. Today, most wealth is a matter of being of picking your parents well or being lucky enough to have the right parents. Well, that kind of a system can easily lead to an aristocracy, an oligarchy, such as we have, but a much, much even tighter oligarchy that has more and more power. So that's part of the system that needs to be addressed. I'm not in favor of taxing the wealthy because we want to make them in any way, we want to pick on them or vilify them. That's not why you want to tax the wealthy. You want to tax the wealthy for two reasons. One, because you need the revenue to pay for everything else you need to do. And secondly, because you actually do want to cut back on the political power that the wealthy are bound to have when they have hundreds of billions of dollars.
Which leads me to something I wanted to ask you early on. The book, the system is it's great, but it's almost a letter that you wrote, almost like a letter you wrote to Jamie Dimon from J.P. Morgan. Basically, you refer to him at many points in here, and I think your description of him was fascinating. You describe him as someone well-intentioned, who considers himself a progressive, who in many ways works for progressive causes, but simply doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand that the economic policies he's following have hurt the country. I don't know if that's a fair characterization of how you describe it, but I'm wondering if you ever got a response from to the book.
Actually, when the book actually was one reason I wrote the book, or at least had the idea of making Jamie Dimon the foil, not the villain. He's not the villain.
No, he wasn't foil. It's the
He's
best
the foil,
description.
and there is a big difference because he called me one day a couple of years ago, and he was angry at something that I had said, and I was impressed both that he called me, but also that he was as defensive as he was. And I thought, well, this deserves a little bit of inquiry. And I discovered that he is an interesting man. He's a very able. He calls himself a Democrat and a progressive, and he ostensibly is very concerned about widening inequality and the plight of the poor in this country and so on. And yet he seems to be remarkably unaware of how he has contributed to the very problems he talks about.
Yeah, and I think that's true of all of the people you describe in the book. Several other, very, very wealthy people who, some probably more so than others, don't realize of how the system has impacted people. And that gets back to your point that this is a system problem rather than a problem of bad individuals necessarily.
And I should say before we end, Bill, that I'm encouraged by the Biden administration so far. I'm encouraged by what Joe Biden is trying to do. I'm encouraged by the kind of people he has brought on,
Right.
by the policies he's seeking, and the reasons he is seeking those policies. I think that America has been given a reprieve by his election from a drift toward authoritarianism. And the question is whether we take advantage of this reprieve and do what we need to do, or whether it's a temporary reprieve and we don't do enough, and therefore we find ourselves in 4 years or 8 years back on the track toward authoritarianism.
Well, I totally agree with you, and I share your optimism that we could probably do it, but I also share your worry that if we don't not careful, we could slip back on in the track toward the authoritarianism. This may be a good place to end. I think we're right at the end of the hour, and I really want to thank you because listening to you and reading the book just gives me every time I listen to you or look at any of the pages of the book, I learn something more about the economy. And
Well,
I'm sure that your readers are going to feel the same way.
well, thank you, Bill. I really
Thank you
appreciate
very
your
much.
time, and thank you for your time and your efforts. And Elaine, thank you for your time and effort to make this program work. And thank to again to Book Passage and to Extended Session.
And I thank you both so much. And I know that most of the people who are watching bought a ticket and are getting a copy of the system, which makes me very happy because this is a page turner and it also inspires us all to do what we absolutely can to be engaged and make changes. One of the reasons I'm so proud to be involved with Dominican University and to co-sponsor these Institute for Leadership sessions is that this university is so unusual. I don't have the exact statistics in my hands, but a huge percentage, one of the highest in the state, of the students here are first generation, are consider themselves non-white, and are on full scholarship. And I recently saw a study that of the 10 top universities whose students' first jobs bring them a big jump in income for their family, Dominican University is one of those 10. Most of the others are very, very Ivy League type universities. So it's really exciting for Book Passage to be part of the Dominican family. And I just want to thank everyone who's contributed to this university and helped to make it what it is. And to you, Professor Reich, for having come back again for us. I learned so much and I have hope, and that is really quite wonderful. We do have our next Institute for Leadership session is March 4th with Isabel Allende, who has written a book called The Soul of a Woman. It is both a memoir and a really strong feminist book. So I hope you'll come and be with us then. We have 2 more, which I'll tell you about later. But I'm inspired, and I thank both of you for an amazing evening. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And thank
Thank
you. You make me want to go back to the university and take your class.
Well, you're welcome. Bye-bye.
Okay,
I
thanks.
can tell you this, being married to Bill, he cannot wait to get that information about antitrust because it's one of his passions.
Good.
Thanks,
Well, that's
Bill.
excellent. We'll have a movement.
Good.
Okay, great.
Thank you. I hope
Thanks so
everyone,
much.
the thousands of people in the audience will do this with us. Good night.
Okay, good night.